There is a quiet arithmetic that a lot of millennials run almost constantly without quite meaning to. Their age, minus where they thought they'd be by now, equals a number that feels uncomfortably large. No house yet, no savings that feel like savings, career still in progress, relationship status complicated, and underneath all of it, a low, persistent feeling that everyone else figured something out that they didn't, that the train left, and they're still on the platform. Millennials report feeling behind in life at rates significantly higher than previous generations at the same age. And the instinct from the outside is familiar by now. They say, stop comparing yourself. Be grateful for what you have. You're doing fine. It's not a race. But here is the thing about feeling behind it doesn't respond well to being told it isn't happening because the feeling has sources, real ones, and understanding them is more useful than dismissing them. Picture the scene. A millennial opens Instagram on a Tuesday night. In the next 4 minutes, they will see an influencer their age who somehow owns a house in 3 cities, a former classmate's kitchen renovation, a vacation that cost more than their monthly rent, a promotion post, an engagement announcement from someone they vaguely knew in college, and a birth announcement. None of this is real in any complete sense. The kitchen renovation didn't show the credit card debt that funded it. The promotion post didn't mention the anxiety attack in the parking garage beforehand. The vacation was partially sponsored. The influencer's portfolio is more complicated than it appears. But the millennial doesn't know any of that. What they know is what they saw. And what they saw in 4 minutes was evidence that everyone is further along than they are. They close the app. They open it again 40 seconds later. The easy answer is that millennials are too online, too addicted to comparison, too unwilling to log off and live their actual lives. And there is genuinely something to that. The compulsive scroll, the passive consumption of other people's highlight reels, the way social media has turned ordinary life milestones into public performance, these are real mechanisms that produce real psychological damage. Millennials are not imagining the effect, but blaming the phone misses the deeper structure underneath it because social media didn't create the feeling of being behind. It created a delivery system, perfectly engineered, for a feeling that was already there. The phone is the amplifier. Force 1, the milestone mismatch. Previous generations had a fairly legible script for adulthood. Finish school by your early 20s, get a stable job, get married, buy a house, have children, in roughly that order, on roughly that timeline. And crucially, the economic conditions of the mid-20th century made that script achievable for a broad swath of the population. A single income could support a family. A house cost 2 or 3 times the average annual salary. A pension was standard. The path was bumpy but navigable. By the time millennials arrived at adulthood, the economic scaffolding underneath that script had largely been removed. Houses now cost 8 to 12 times the median annual salary in most major cities. Stable long-term employment has been replaced by contract work and gig economy arrangements. Student debt has made the starting line of adulthood a deficit position, rather than a neutral one. The milestones didn't move. The conditions required to reach them did. And a generation measuring itself against a script written for a different economic era will feel perpetually behind, not because they are failing, but because the script was never updated to reflect the world they actually live in. A boomer was often a homeowner by 26, not because they were more disciplined, more focused, more deserving, because in 1978, the median home price was roughly twice the median household income. Today, that ratio sits closer to 6 or 7 to 1 nationally, and in major cities where most professional jobs are located, it climbs well beyond that. And those same cities offer a choice that previous generations rarely had to make: pay the rent that proximity to work demands, or leave for somewhere affordable, and figure out the career from there. The boomer's home was often a standalone house purchased on one income. The millennial's equivalent, if it comes at all, is more likely a condo, purchased on 2 full-time incomes, in a city they can barely afford to live in. Because that's where the jobs are. That is not a lifestyle preference. That is arithmetic. Force 2, the social media machine, Let's be specific about what social media actually does, because it is more sophisticated than simple comparison. Every major platform millennials grew up on, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, was designed by engineers whose explicit goal was to maximize engagement. And the content that maximizes engagement is not the content that makes you feel good. It is the content that produces a strong emotional response: envy, aspiration, anxiety, inadequacy. These are high engagement emotions. They keep you scrolling, they keep you coming back. The algorithm did not accidentally make millennials feel behind. It was optimized, iteratively, over years, to find the exact content that would produce that feeling reliably. Millennials were not weak for falling for it. They were the first generation to be subjected to it, at scale, during the exact years they were forming their adult identities, with no prior understanding of what it was doing to them. And unlike previous generations who could compare themselves to their immediate social circle, their neighborhood, their workplace, millennials were handed a comparison pool of billions. Every person on Earth with an internet connection and a highlight reel. Against that pool, everyone feels behind. That is not an accident. That is the product. Force 3, the internal scoreboard. Here's where the honest part comes in. Millennials are, by most psychological measures, extraordinarily hard on themselves. The same generation that struggles most with anxiety and perfectionism is also the generation most likely to interpret external setbacks as internal failures. The house didn't arrive on time, not because the market is broken, but because I didn't work hard enough. The career isn't where it should be, not because the economy restructured, but because I made wrong choices. The internal scoreboard doesn't account for structural forces. It just tracks the gap between where you are and where you thought you'd be, and assigns blame accordingly. And that scoreboard, running constantly, quietly, underneath everything else, is one of the more exhausting things about being a millennial. The feeling of being behind is real. The conclusion that it means something is wrong with you is not. Here's the question worth sitting with: behind compared to what exactly? The timeline millennials are measuring themselves against was written by a different generation, for a different economy, under different conditions, and handed down as though it were a law of nature rather than a cultural artifact of a specific historical moment. The 30-year-old who owns a home and has 2 kids and a stable career, that image was constructed in the 1950s, and it has been haunting every generation since. Millennials didn't fall behind that image. The image was always a partial fiction, accessible to some, aspirational for most, and contingent on economic conditions that no longer exist. What would it mean to measure a millennial life by the standards that actually apply to millennial circumstances? By that measure, a generation carrying record debt, navigating a broken housing market, surviving multiple economic crises, and still building careers and relationships and meaning, is not behind. It is doing something considerably harder than the script ever accounted for. So the next time a millennial does the math, age minus expectation, and comes up short, it is worth interrupting the calculation, not to tell them the feeling isn't real. It is real, but to ask, whose timeline is this? And why does it get to be the measure? The house, the promotion, the relationship status, the savings account that looks like a savings account. These things are worth wanting, but they are not a scoreboard. And the life being lived in the meantime, the relationships built, the skills accumulated, the crises survived, the adaptations made, counts, even when the algorithm is working very hard to suggest otherwise. The generation that feels most behind is also the generation that has had to be most resourceful, most flexible, most willing to rebuild the script from scratch when the original stopped making sense. That is not nothing. That is, depending on how you look at it, exactly what being on track looks like for a generation that inherited a world that kept changing the definition. Even now, even still, somewhere a millennial is closing the app, taking a breath, and deciding that what they have right now is enough to work with.